Girls, welcome back to the Noobie Podcast, Noobie Photographer Podcast, just to be specific. I am your host, Nathan Holritz. It's good to have you here along for the ride on this brand new project, this brand new podcast. We are dedicated to helping simplify photography and photography business for new photographers. So if you're just getting ready, like you're thinking about starting a business, or you're in the first few years of running a photography business, this podcast is for you. A lot of short form content, easy to consume, easy to go apply to your business. And we're starting the podcast off with a series called I Wish I Knew. And I'm having established photographers come on the show and share a big idea or principle that they wish they understood at the outset of their business when they launched their business to help save you a little bit of pain and stress as you're getting your business started. And to that end, I have a brand new guest with me today. Kellee Marie with Kellee Marie Photography is here. Kellee, Kellee, do you prefer to go by Kellee Clarke or Kellee Marie? What's your preference?
Oh, I went with Kellee Marie. So, I'm not married yet. I'll be getting married next week, actually.
No way.
Yeah, so my surname will be changing. So I'm like, well, I'll just go with Kellee Marie. And it had a good ring to it, so
it's great. Yeah, no complaints here by any means. And actually, this is just a great segue into giving you a couple of seconds here, if we have that, a minute or two, to introduce your photography business. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do as a professional photographer.
So I'm a Western art and lifestyle photographer based in Wichita Falls. So basically, think anything cattle, horses, ranch, and cowboy. That's my niche and what I specialize in.
And as you're talking here, I'm actually going to pull up your website. For anybody listening in, you can go to Kellee, Kellee, Marie, Maree.com, and see Kellee's website there, the work that she's doing. We'll also link to Instagram, which you can see here if you're watching the live stream, Kellee Marie Photography on Instagram. We'll also link to that in the show notes at bokehpodcast.com. Kellee, I'm just scrolling through your work here on Instagram, and I mean, it's just really beautiful work. And what an interesting lifestyle. Did you grow up in this world around farms?
Well, yeah, I grew up in Australia on a sheep and cattle farm. And then I got into rodeo, and I just love the Western style of life, the cowboy things. So I actually rodeoed in Australia, and then 12 years ago, I moved here to the U.S. and into Texas, and this is my lifestyle now. I live on a ranch, and my fiance and I raise horses and cattle, and so basically, it's a whole life.
I love it, and I've spent a little bit of time in Australia. I love the culture there. I especially love Australian people. They've just got a great vibe. That was my experience. And in fact, you may have heard me say earlier, no worries. That's something that I picked up while I was over there. And I love the phrase, no worries, no worries. But what I find really great too is that I'm starting to hear a little bit of that Texas accent mixing with your Australian accent. How long have you been here in the States?
12 years. So
awesome.
There's got to be a little bit of a mix in there at some point, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I grew up overseas myself. And then I've lived kind of all over the US and one end to the other. So my accent's kind of mixed together as well. Totally get it. But speaking of the amount of time you've been here in the States, did you start your photography business at the beginning of that time period, or how long have you been a photographer?
Oh, so I've been doing things professionally with my business for about 2 years. So I came over here and worked in the horse industry, the cutting horse industry to be specific. Okay. And that was very, it took a lot of my time. So I've always been into photography and it's been a hobby, but until about 2 years ago, it wasn't till then that I actually was like, okay, I need to start trying to educate myself. I feel like I have a good eye for this. So yeah, 2 years ago is when I sold my first print.
Lovely. Well, again, your work is truly beautiful, and I've seen a lot of photography over the years. So I hope that says something. But yeah, beautiful, beautiful work. And for everybody listening in, I've been posting this as Kellee's been talking. But again, KelleeMarie.com. You can see there on the screen, and then Kellee Marie Photography on Instagram. We'll link to those in the show notes at NoobiePodcast.com. Make sure you go visit and follow Kellee's work. Kellee, let's actually kind of transition directly into this conversation, though. We're doing this series, I Wish I Knew, and I'm curious, what was the big concept, principle, idea that you wish you knew, even just a couple of years ago? I know you're relatively early in your career, but what is something that you wish you knew early on that you feel like would have made a big difference, maybe kind of fast tracking your career a little bit?
So, there were a couple of things I thought of, but I woke up one morning after, trying to come up with an idea for this podcast, and I had a totally different track I was going to go on, but I literally woke up and auto mode slapped me in the face. And I was
Hmm.
like, that was one thing. I got stuck in auto mode on my camera because of the fear of stepping out of my comfort zone. And I didn't have the time, I was working so much, I didn't have the time for the education side of it. So I would try to play around with my settings, but then I'd switch it back to that little green mode, auto. And I got stuck there far too long.
It's interesting when you originally said to me or shared this concept with me about getting out of auto mode. I immediately went to kind of going on auto mode as a business owner, as a photographer, just kind of going with what you're comfortable with. But I think it actually makes sense in the context of this conversation.
Yes, completely. And for me, because I didn't have a lot of time, so I'd get out, I'd go out amongst the cows to take some photos. And if the lighting wasn't completely right and I couldn't get, jack around my settings enough, and be like, just pop it on that little green button and let's go with that. And I really wish that I had just stepped out of that a long time ago, because once I did, it was life changing.
Well, so let's just jump right into the nitty gritty, the practical application here for new photographers. And by the way, I can very much relate to you. I mean, most of the photography that I do these days is on my phone, and naturally, these phones have just stunning cameras, and what they can do in so-called auto mode is amazing, right? So it's easy to fall back on that crutch. But I hear you. As a wedding photographer, I shot for about 10 years, and the ability to be able to go in and engage with your camera and intentionally set up an image using some of those manual settings really can make a big difference on multiple levels. The quality of the work, the way that you're engaging with your subjects, the way you're ultimately trying to create a photograph, there's more intention there. And having an understanding, a technical understanding of what's driving a beautiful image can also be helpful, again, on multiple levels. So a lot of value. How would
Yeah.
you recommend our listeners, particularly new photographers who are just getting started, that can relate to what you're talking about here? How would you recommend they take steps to kind of get out of that auto mode to begin to use more of the settings in the camera?
Yeah, so okay, I started off with a Nikon D3200, and it had the auto mode on it. And at the time, it was like, yep, you're a beginner. That's a great way to start, which I really do think it was. So what I ended up doing, I upgraded to a full frame D600, D610, sorry, and it doesn't have auto mode on it. So it was like sink or swim. But what I actually did was I would take note of the settings that my camera had with the auto mode, like the ISO, aperture, and things. I'd be like, okay, that was that lighting condition on that day. And then I would apply them to my other camera and see if it worked. But after, that's time consuming as well. But education then became my thing. I listened to podcasts. I got on YouTube. I got on the Nikon website. And then I actually found one of my friends. She's my friend now, but at the time I just knew of her, and I'd seen some of her photography amongst the Western horse industry. And I was like, wow, I just love her style. Well, I started following her on Instagram. Well, she started a photography education group through Instagram and Facebook, and it was life changing. Like just learning your camera settings, editing, and all those things. And I think a lot of people get caught up in that. I've got to pay all this money and spend all this time on education, but there are so many resources at our fingertips like that.
For sure. Yeah. Okay. So, but I'm taking notes here. I actually want to go back to that original approach that you took, which I think is really interesting. You look at the settings on the camera that was in auto mode, and then you experiment with those settings, the shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO settings on this new camera, the upgraded camera that you purchased, and see the results. And then were you making further adjustments after you saw the result using those settings?
Yeah, and because I honestly, when I would be in auto mode, it didn't always take the perfect picture. And so I'd get in situations where I'd be like, oh, I knew it needed more light, or it needed more this or that. Whereas on my new camera, I could then go and adjust it, and it was like a moment. It's like, oh, the stars are aligning. And then once you dive even further into like your white balance and things like that, that was another huge game changer, especially for my style of photography.
So in that case, then, I mean, we already have, and I know for new photographers, this can be a little bit overwhelming. It took me a little bit to get the hang of what this meant technically. And I actually started in film and then transitioned to digital. And so, I mean, I didn't really have a choice but to shoot it right? I'm not getting that immediate feedback on the back of the LCD screen. But you have ISO, then you have the shutter speed, aperture settings, and then you're also adding into the mix white balance, which honestly, I very rarely anyway, got into manually adjusting white balance. I was letting the camera do the work. That's for lack of a better word, brave of you to go there, like to add that additional moving part to the mix. Do you recommend that for most new photographers to go ahead and add that additional element, I guess, to the equation when it comes to capturing a photo manually?
For me, like I'm a natural light chaser with my photography. It makes a huge impact on my photography. And then it was actually Lauren, who I did the educational group with. She was the one who started talking about white balance. I'm like, well, I knew I saw it on my camera, but I just had it on auto. Another thing, I was on auto again, which was great, but I was drawn to that warmer look in my photos, and that's what attracted me to her photography, was the warmth in them. And then once I realized how to make them warmer, it was like I couldn't believe it. Like it was huge, and it saved in my editing a lot. So coming out of the camera, they were looking more and more how I liked my photos to look.
Sure. That makes sense. So I guess just very simply put, it enables you to be more intentional in the way that you're capturing the photograph. And I know, I mean, and I'm guilty of the same with these cameras doing so much, or they can do so much automatically for us. It's easy to rely on the camera, number one, but then two, just to think, oh, I'll go fix that later in post-production. And the reality is we're taking up a lot of time by doing just that. If we can be intentional what we're trying to capture by adjusting those settings manually in camera and getting it right as much as possible anyway in camera, it's going to save a lot of time on the back end if we're doing our own editing, or money if we're outsourcing that editing work. It can make a really big difference in that regard. So, okay, I'm a practical kind of next steps kind of guy. So I'm taking notes here as you're talking. That the first step then was to actually use the automatic settings as a point of reference when beginning to use or to learn manual settings. I think that's a great first step. Then number two is the education piece. And you mentioned having connected with this photographer who you've since become friends with. Is that a particular resource that you'd recommend to our listeners, or are there other specific resources that you end up leveraging as well to develop your knowledge base as you're building your business that you would recommend to the community?
Like if you can, I believe like if you find someone to do some kind of photography education group, you've got to click with them for sure. So, and that was really easy for me to click with her because we were in the same industry and, shot the same kind of things, except she does weddings and I do not do weddings. Like YouTube was so good. Like I just put my camera model in and it's a crazy how much free resources there are. And then I have quite a long commute to my job. So podcasts were it. And it's crazy how much you can learn from podcasts. So yeah, things like that. And then even getting on the website that, for the camera that you use, they have fantastic. And they usually, a lot of them are just like short little videos. You can find specifically what you want to go and check out, like shutter speed or something like that. And yeah, you can go watch a 5-minute video on shutter speed and stuff. It's really amazing what you can find.
It is. And I probably sound like the old person, but when I think back to when I got started, this is around 2001, 2002, I was looking at books back then because YouTube wasn't really a thing. Social media certainly wasn't a thing. And so that was my point of reference. And then we had back in the day before Facebook groups, it was photography forums. So they had these forums we'd get on and ask questions and share pictures and get ideas. But all that to say, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, whether it's a forum or a Facebook group, it's absolutely important to connect with a community of photographers that you can trust, that you can share ideas with, where you can encourage each other. And for that matter, just spend some time with like-minded people that are doing some of the same stuff, whether it's the same genre or not. Being involved in photography, share ideas, stories, support each other. I think that's important, number one. Two, you mentioned the significance of YouTube, and it really can't be underestimated. It seems like such an obvious thing in this day and age, but the reality is there are probably a lot of people still not taking advantage of that free resource There is so much information to be had there if you're willing to just sit down, take some time and review it. And you can pretty much look up any topic and get information on it. So that's two. And then you mentioned a third thing. Oh, you mentioned just general websites, going and searching websites. Is that right?
Yeah. No. Yeah. Just like the camera manufacturer websites.
Camera manufacturers. Okay.
Really, and there is like I know there's groups you can actually get a paid membership and you can sort of do stuff like that as well, and it's relatively cheap.
Yeah, I think Nikon and Canon both offer memberships. Is that right?
Both. They have exceptional services. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I think these are really good practical recommendations for our listeners. Anything that you want to kind of finish up with here as we close out the show?
I don't think so. The one thing I did, like if I wanted to say a third thing that I did, I basically threw myself in the deep end and started doing portrait shoots. Like just, like, hey, let me take your photo. And that way it put me in that situation where I had to make it work. So when I started out, I still had my trusty, like the D3200 with the auto setting on one hip and then my other camera on the other hip in case I got in a bind. But yeah, just throw yourself in there and do it.
I cannot. That's some of the best advice that we've gotten on the show yet. I think it's so true. And we can't go into it completely blind. That would be a bit irresponsible of us, especially if there's a job at hand. But at some point, after you've done the due diligence, as you were just describing, making the connections with community, learning from them, having those conversations, getting into educational content via YouTube, websites, et cetera, and certainly doing practice on your own, at some point you've got to take the leap. And in first world 2022, it's so easy to get in our head and overthink things because we have the luxury and the space and the time to do just that. And we can kind of get in the way of our own selves by doing just that, right? At some point you've got to take the leap and do the thing. When I went and shot my first wedding, I mean, I'd combed through these books for who knows how long, endless hours. And at that point, I mean, we could go to a website or two. I don't know how much I actually did that at that point. It wasn't maybe as common, but I had spent the time trying to understand the technical piece, certainly of photography, but also getting points of reference and some inspiration from other photographers. But I just had to go do the thing. And that first wedding that I photographed, and this is 2001, I had a film camera, and then I borrowed somebody else that I worked with at the time. I was working in the optics industry. I borrowed their camera because it was the same camera, so I knew how it worked. I put color film in one, and I put black and white film in the other, and these were my two cameras. And I went and photographed this wedding. I ended up missing the kiss during the ceremony, which was it's so awful, but it really, really incredible bride and groom. I just went to him and said, hey, look, I screwed up. Like I missed this kiss. Can we go back in and just set the shot up? They were super gracious. We went back in, the bridal party, the minister, everything. And we mixed it. At the time, it was, physical proofs in an album. And so once we put that proof or those images from the so-called ceremony and the kiss into that album, you wouldn't have known the difference. And it worked out totally fine. So you run the risk of, some of these things happen at some point in your career. If we just sit around and think about those all day long, we're never going to get started. We have to take the leap. And I think that's just incredible advice.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you being willing to come on and share with our listeners today. And I know that we just barely scratched the surface, even in this topic of the technical specifications of a great image, how to use our camera to capture an image. But this is a good introduction for our new photographers. Will you remind our listeners where they can learn more about your brand, but then potentially ask you a question or two on social media as well?
Absolutely. I hang out. And I've just started Pinterest, but I'm still working on that.
Okay, say that one more time. The music is interfering with your mic and muted you. No. One more time. Tell them where they can find you.
I hang out on Instagram and Facebook. Just started Pinterest, but I'm still working on that. But Instagram and Facebook are my jam.
Okay, perfect. So Kellee Marie Photography, I've got this up on the screen here. And then, of course, kelleemarie.com. Everybody, thank you so much for making time to come hang out with us today. Thanks again, Kellee, for making time to share with us.
Nathan, appreciate it.